Most people are throwing away their hard-earned money because they decided to buy a house rather than renting, and vice versa. So how do you make the smart choice financially in 2025 going into 2026? I'll go over what nobody is really talking about when making the renting versus buying decision. And in fact, there are only 3 simple tests that I recommend you use to come to a decision whether you're going to end up renting or buying a house. And it's based off of your current situation, which I'll cover in a bit. I'm also going to talk about the 3 primary options you'll likely fall into from a financial perspective and how you can use those 3 tests to determine which option you should choose depending on where you're at in your life. So let me go ahead and bring up the whiteboard to demonstrate that. So option number 1 is house hacking, where you live in one bedroom and then you rent out the other rooms to housemates, where the housemates' rental income will pay for your mortgage payment and some of the utility bills. Option number 2, super simple, is renting. And then finally, option number 3 is to buy a house that you'll live in, but you're not going to rent it out to housemates. So let's go over how you can decide between those 3 options. Well, this brings me to test number 1, which I call the live for free test. This test is used to decide between going with option number 1, which is house hacking, or option number 2, which is renting. It's super simple. You just ask yourself, if you do option number 1, which is house hack, does the rental income that you get from the housemates cover the mortgage payment, including taxes and insurance, and the utility bills, or at least your share of the utility bills? If the answer is yes, then you want to go with option number 1, house hacking, and that's because when you buy a house and house hack it, you not only have the tenants paying down the mortgage for you or the loan for you, but you also save on having to pay rent, which is money you never see again. And then finally, you get something called appreciation, which is the value of the house going up over time. Because I'm in California, it's very typical to see a lot of the California properties going up on average of $35,000 a year. And that's really one of the best ways you can build your wealth, and probably one of the biggest benefits to house hacking. Now, obviously, if you're unable to live for free, meaning your rental income does not cover that mortgage payment plus utility bills, then you should go with option number 2, which is renting. Okay, let's say based off of the first test, you go with option number 1, which is house hacking. Most people worry about, what about my privacy? Will I even get along with the housemates that I live with? These are the exact things that I feared when I first bought my house hack in Sacramento, California. I was really afraid of getting a squatter, which is a renter who basically takes the room but stops paying their rent completely. And then you can't get them to leave unless you evict them. That was my number 1 fear. The second thing I worried about is, what if I get a sex offender or a criminal? Luckily, there's a way to look that up very easily. You can go to the sex offender registry, or you can go to your local county criminal court records to look up any criminal cases under somebody's name. And luckily, all of that is completely free. However, I found my house hacking experience actually rather pleasant. I'm somebody who doesn't like to live completely alone, and I also wanted to really build up my financial wealth at a very early stage in my life. And both of those were accomplished by doing my house hacking in Sacramento, California. Not only that, but I really enjoyed the social aspect of being able to talk with my housemates about the latest video game that was just released, or a lot of times travel tips, because I personally love to travel the world and explore different cultures. So talking about, hey, where have you been? What do you recommend to eat in that particular city, etc. And what's great about a house hack is you're the boss. You get to decide who you bring into your house, and you don't have to be forced to bring in the tenant from hell. Of course, you have to screen them, just like you would probably get to know somebody and talk to them before they become your friend. So if you don't know me, I'm actually a pharmacist by career. And so naturally, I'm very organized and analytical. I wanted to bring in like-minded people who also preferred a quiet study environment to focus and to rest. And we're not into throwing any wild house parties or anything like that. Basically, I was looking to find other people like me who also loved to serve their community. And because I'm analytical, I basically wrote down the top 5 characteristics that I was looking for in a housemate. And I would do a quick mini interview with them and ask them questions to really figure out if they met most of those characteristics. Typically, if they had at least 4 out of the 5 characteristics that I was looking for, then I would bring them into the house. Now, another really cool thing you can do for house hacking is to do what my client did, which was buy a multi-unit property like a duplex, which is 2 houses put together where they share the same driveway and then they share some of the walls, and that's about it. And what you can do is rent out one unit, and the rent from that unit could help cover the mortgage for both the units. And it's nice because you have a higher level of privacy. When my client lived in the duplex, he didn't notice any noise disturbances or anything like that. It was pretty much a completely separate unit. Again, they only just shared the driveway and a few of the walls. So I have an interesting story about this client. See, he had a fiance who was really not bought into real estate at all. She thought that real estate was overhyped, not a good financial investment because especially putting down the large down payment, a lot of that money, it felt like she was putting all of her eggs in one basket, as she described it. And she was naturally afraid of losing all of her savings to a problem property. So I discussed this with my client and I suggested to him maybe he eases her into it by getting a duplex so that they have more privacy, especially when they have a child later on. And luckily, when they started seeing cash flow coming in, the fiance got really excited about it. She was like, wow, this is actually possible for us. And it's not just all hype. It's actually very profitable. When she saw the mortgage was being covered by the other tenants on the other unit, she actually wanted to invest more into real estate herself from her other savings account. So she caught the real estate bug after all. So now that we talked about what a house hack generally feels like, let's go over the math behind owning a house versus renting a house. Let me go ahead and bring up the whiteboard to explain. So here are the general expenses for your rent costs. They're super simple. You have your rent, your utilities, tenant-inflicted repairs, which are basically any damages that you cause to the property. And then you have your supplies like your kitchenware, maybe your soap, your towels, your laundry detergent, your garbage bags, etc. And that's pretty much it for the rent. What they say is the rent is your ceiling. Basically, that's the most you're ever going to really have to pay on the property for the most part. However, what they say instead about buying is the mortgage payment that you pay, that's actually your floor. That's the lowest that you're going to pay. So you're most likely going to pay a lot more because there's a couple other expenses to keep in mind. So let's go over them real quick. When you're buying a property, those are the costs up here. Now, this middle column here, those are one-time payment items. So your down payment, your closing costs, your renovations, your cost for furnishing the place, those are only one-time costs. You pay it once and then you're set for the rest of the rental. Now, of course, there's also ongoing costs, and those are on the far right over here. That includes your mortgage, your utilities, unless the tenant is paying them themselves, maintenance and repair costs, landscaping, vacancy, which is basically the cost if people are not renting out your property and might sit on the market, and so you're paying out of pocket. And then there's HOA, which is homeowners association dues. If you're under an HOA, I highly recommend not being under an HOA. But what a lot of people don't realize is the biggest difference between renting versus buying, which is what I call the upside and the cost offsets. Let's go ahead and go over that on the whiteboard. So this is all the upside of buying a property. You get the rental income, you get equity buildup, which is when the tenants are paying off the mortgage and the loan for you. You get cash flow as long as your rental income minus your mortgage payment and expenses is positive. Then you get appreciation, which is the value of the house going up over time. And then finally, you get tax benefits. And that allows you to pay a lot less taxes on the profits that you make on your rentals. The biggest point I want to make here is that buying a house obviously has a lot more costs associated with it, but it also has a lot of upside, which renting doesn't have any of those upside things that I listed on this chart. Let's take appreciation, for example. Let's say you buy a $400,000 house and it appreciates 7% per year. Well, that means it goes up $28,000 every single year, which really builds up your wealth. And that's just by sitting on that property. Now, let's say you want to buy a primary residence to live in, but you don't want to house hack it and rent it to other housemates because maybe you want more privacy. How do you decide between doing that versus renting? This is where test number 2 comes in, which basically states that if the rent cost is greater than the cost of your monthly mortgage, including taxes and insurance, then it's better to buy a house to live in without housemates because it's going to cost more for renting. And so in that case, you would go with option number 3, buy a house to live in without housemates. Don't forget, you also get appreciation, a lot of tax benefits, etc. when you buy a house to live in, even if you don't have the housemates. The key here is the specific mortgage payment that you make on a monthly basis is highly dependent on how much of a down payment you put on the property. Let's say you bought the property 100% cash. That means all you have to pay then is property taxes and insurance because you won't have a mortgage payment in that specific scenario. So usually in that case, it's going to cost more to pay rent versus just paying property taxes and insurance. So the answer to test number 2 is relative to how much of a down payment you can put on that property. Sometimes you might have to put a 20% or 30% or maybe even 40% down payment in order to get it so the rent cost is about the same as your monthly mortgage payment. Now, let's say you're just beginning and you can only put a very low down payment on the house, meaning the mortgage payment is going to be very high. Usually, it's not a great idea. You'd rather rent instead because that mortgage payment is likely going to be higher than your rent payment. Finally, for those who are deciding between renting versus buying a house without living together with housemates, there is test number 3. Maybe, for example, you have kids and so you can't live with other housemates, for example, or maybe you just want that independence. Test number 3 is, do I value being a homeowner today more than I value having a solid financial future? And if the answer is yes, that's completely okay because life is all about trade-offs. You can buy a house now without having housemates paying off the mortgage for you, but there are implications later on. Maybe you have to work extra hard, put in longer hours to really build up your wealth and your savings. However, what I would suggest is more of a middle ground instead. If you value your privacy, buy a duplex like my client did. Or you can consider option number 2, renting for now until you build up a large enough down payment so that test number 2 works out for you, meaning that you put a large enough down payment on the property so that your mortgage payment is less than the rent you would pay in that same area. So for example, let's say your rent in that area is $2,500 a month. The question you need to ask yourself is, how much of a down payment do I need to put on that property in order for my mortgage payment to be $2,500 a month or less? And that could be a 20% down, it could be a 30% down, it could be a 50% down. It really depends on the interest rates and the cost of the property. But if you are able to answer those questions, it's very easy to decide, hey, should I do option number 1, house hack, option number 2, renting, or option number 3, live at the house without having housemates, which is perfectly fine as long as that mortgage payment is less than the rent in the area. Generally speaking, as early on in life, I recommend starting off with option number 1, house hacking, because you're probably going to build the most wealth through that. Then, if you can't do that, do option number 2, and then finally, option number 3. So I hope this video was super helpful for you guys in deciding whether to buy a house versus renting. As usual, if you enjoyed it, don't forget to give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and share it with your friends or others who are really struggling with getting started in real estate investing. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you on next week's video.